For most students, how to pay for school is a major consideration. Student loan debt is a $1.5 trillion financial crisis in America. The average household with student debt owes more than $47,000. Mark Strassman examines the issue in a special CBS News series, Life and Debt.
Let me show you one measure of the price tag. America's student loan debt is greater than car loan debt and credit card debt. College has become wildly expensive for most families.
Wages nearly doubled in 22 years, going from $22,000 a year in 1950 to $40,000 a year in 1972. What was going on in the college tuition arena during this time? I could not find good data that was reliable enough for me to post to my channel for 1950 from the University of Minnesota, because different degrees like teaching and nursing and chemistry, there was a different cost of tuition per degree. So I couldn't get a good estimate of what a 4-year degree cost a student in 1950. I could, however, do that for 1956. In 1956, adjusted for inflation to 2010 dollars, 4 years of tuition at the University of Minnesota was $13,700 a year, or it took the average worker 1,000 hours of work to pay for 4 years of college. Roughly half a year's of work, because there's 40 hours in a week, 50 weeks in a year, 2,000 hours of working hours in a year. So it took 1,000 hours or half a year to pay for 4 years of college tuition. By 1965, that had fallen to $7,165. That's 4 years of tuition in 2010 dollars, adjusted for inflation. College tuition used to be cheap in this country. The average worker had to work roughly 400 hours. That's 10 weeks of work to pay for 4 years of college. The average worker could cut his kid's college tuition check with 3 weeks of work each year after taxes. By 1972, college tuition cost a little bit more. It cost $10,000. 1980, it cost $9,800 for 4 years of tuition. Look what's happened since. It was $7,165 in 1965 for my uncle and my dad. Today, our country's expecting my children to pay 6 times more, basically. 2010 tuition was $41,280 to pay for 4 years of tuition. Why is your generation, the Millennials, expected to carry roughly 6 times the student debt, have 6 times the student loans of my dad's generation?
Oh, I say it again, you've been had. You've been took. You've been hoodwinked, bamboozled, led astray, run amok.
And yet college is one instance, maybe the only one, when banks will consider a teenager with no credit history, no guaranteed income, and a loan that can run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars.
The most expensive piece of paper I own.
College changed Taylor Smith's life for the better. College debt changed it for the worse. Now 25, this sales rep for a Houston tech company feels pressured by loans she started taking out as a college-bound high school senior.
You were 18 and people were loaning you tens of thousands of dollars.
Yeah, exactly. And nobody's talking to you about it either.
When Smith graduated from Texas A&M, she owed $53,000 in student loans. She had to quit her first job, registering voters in Colorado. It didn't pay enough.
I sacrificed the dream job to come home so I could take care of my bills.
Oh, I say it again, you've been had. You've been took. You've been hoodwinked.
That was a big reality check, realizing like this bill that I have is what's going to hold me back.
43 million Americans currently have student debt. On average, they owe more than $47,000. 5.2 million are in default. And college costs keep rising. For example, at Ohio State, a public university, in-state students pay around $27,000 a year. An elite private school like Stanford costs about $74,000.
Americans forget from 1937 till 1980, this was basically a democratic socialist country. We had such programs under Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal as minimum wage, disability insurance, unemployment insurance, Social Security. These are all ideas that are socialistic in nature. Another socialistic idea we used to practice in the United States was taxing the rich and corporations and using that money to fund services and opportunities for all Americans. You can clearly see the change in our country in this budget from the University of Minnesota. Our students are asked to pay roughly 5.5 times more for college than my grandparents were expected to pay for college. Because in 2017, students are asked to pay $42,000 for tuition. We went from $7,000 to $8,000 for tuition to $42,000 of tuition. Again, that's adjusted for inflation in 2017 dollars. Why is more of the burden being shifted to our students? Well, the answer is simple. It got shifted away from the government. In 1965, 37% of the used budget came from state taxpayer money. Today, it's 18% of the budget. In 1965, federal government gave the University of Minnesota 24% of their budget via corporate and business taxes paid to the national government and personal income taxes paid to the national government. That money was distributed to state university systems. Today, only 15% of the budget comes from the federal government, and much of that money doesn't go to lower tuition for all students. Much of that money funds research on our universities. And those research grants pay for college professors' salaries and does not help lower tuition very much. This other table shows the shift of funding from higher education to other parts of the state budget. This is the shift from 1990 to roughly 2015 on how we're funding our colleges. 16 to 17% of the state budget in 1990 was on other spending, for instance. 14% was on higher education. That has been cut by 7%. Only 7% of the state budget reduces tuition for our students in our universities and colleges that are public here in Minnesota. Where did the 7% of the budget get shifted to? It got shifted to the Health and Human Services budget. Since the economic collapse of 2008, every state, with the exception of 4, has decreased funding for higher ed. Montana, Wisconsin, Wyoming, and North Dakota are the only states to increase education funding. Minnesota has cut higher education funding by roughly 14% since 2008. Or, if you work it out per pupil, it's roughly $1,400 per student is going less to the University of Minnesota's general fund. Another change is average Pell Grants given to students. In 2001, it was $2,300, and that has shrunk to $1,600. I think the next graphic is even more telling of what's changed here. This is from the Star Tribune. Tuition adjusted by decade. The average tuition for the 1960s adjusted to inflation to 2017 dollars was roughly $2,800 in the 1960s. It's $12,400 today. This shows more than roughly a quadrupling of the tuition that comes from students. And then there's another graphic here which shows higher education funding. The state of Minnesota used to give colleges $12,000 per student to help lower the cost of tuition. Now, that has been cut to $6,000 per student.
Oh, I say it again, you've been had.
This is why college is so expensive.
When you get that letter, it is, am I going to school or not? And if I'm going to go to school, I will need to take on more debt than I could possibly fathom.
Seth Frotman's the executive director of the Student Borrower Protection Center, a nonprofit watchdog.
Is student loan debt America's new financial crisis?
I think the student debt crisis is here with no end or change in sight and absolutely zero plan to tackle this at the federal level.
And so I'd like to ask you, would you be willing to stand with my generation and end the student debt crisis by supporting free college for all?
He did ask you yes or no. Would you support free college for all?
I am not for free four-year college for all. No. Thank you.
So let me ask you this, because
And I wish if I was a magic genie and could give that to everyone and we could afford it, I would.
Bernie Sanders was, when he wanted to have Medicare for all and free college, and Hillary Clinton referred to those things as ponies. Everybody wants a pony. But, you know, remember how they said, you know, Bernie's a fairy duster, pie in the sky. How are you going to pay for that? How are you going to pay for free college? Free college for the whole country? We can't afford that. We can't afford. How are you going to pay for that? So they can't afford free college, but guess what they just did? The Senate's military spending increase alone is enough to make up a public college free. Trump wanted to spend an extra $55 billion.
A $54 billion boost to the Department of Defense. President Donald Trump previewed his first budget plan on Monday, which will include a nearly 10% increase in defense spending. In exchange, he's proposing cutbacks for all non-military programs.
As we mentioned, Donald Trump today called for more military spending, more troops, more ships, more submarines, more planes. Well, what about U.S. in relation to other nations?
Yeah, well, that's really what counts, right? If you compare it based on military spending to the top 10 nations in the world. Look, down here at the bottom, you're going to have places like South Korea, Germany, and Japan at about 41 billion. Jump up to the middle, you get the UK at about 56 billion. You get Russia up here with around 66 billion. Then it's Saudi Arabia, interestingly enough. Then China with 215 billion, but that's only 9 of the top 10. Add the U.S. and look at this, almost 600 billion in spending there, almost as much as all the other 9 of the top 10 combined, Anderson.
But guess what? Congress went ahead and they said, that's not enough, Trumpy. So they decided to spend $700 billion more dollars like that. $700 billion more dollars. Now, how much would it cost for free college? It would cost roughly, some people say $45 billion, some people say $65 billion. So let's say 65, take the high number. $65 billion. They could have had that like that. We could all have free college right now because, so those concerns about paying for all that stuff, those concerns were brushed aside Monday night as the Senate overwhelmingly approved an $80 billion annual increase, which turns out to be a $700 billion increase.
This defense bill went through the Senate several times starting in September of 2017. Every time Senator Amy Klobuchar voted to increase defense spending. The final bill passed in June of 2018, and it was a $716 billion defense bill, roughly a $70 to $80 billion increase over the previous year's spending on defense. President Donald Trump asked for a $55 billion increase, but Democrats and Republicans agreed that we should spend $70 to $80 billion more on defense. When they say we can't afford things like free college, keep in mind, free college for every student going to a public university or college in the country would cost between $45 and $65 billion per year. The vote in the Senate was 85 to 10. Only 6 Democrats voted against the bill. I scrolled down the Hill website. The only senators to vote against the bill, which passed 85 to 10 in the U.S. Senate, the only senators on the Democratic side to vote against the bill were Dianne Feinstein, Gillibrand, Harris, Marley, Merkley, and Elizabeth Warren. Bernie Sanders, Rand Paul, and Mike Lee. When Amy Klobuchar says, I wish I were a genie and we could afford free college, but we can't afford it, she is lying to you. She voted to spend $70 billion more on defense. Free college, at the most, is $65 billion more.
I wish if I was a magic genie and could give that to everyone and we could afford it, I would.
So $80 billion every year. $80 billion annual increase in military spending, enough to fully satisfy Sanders' campaign promise of free college. They just did it like that. They just did it like that. Boom. Oh, we need 80 billion more a year. Okay, vote. Boom. Done. No discussion. No talk shows. No endless of editorials. No hand wringing.
I wish if I was a magic genie and could give that to everyone and we could afford it, I would.
No debates with different panels back and forth. Nothing. Just like that. Hey, you want 80? You need 700 more billion dollars? There you go. We got it. By the way, Flint still doesn't have clean water. And you know how much it would cost to fix that? It wouldn't cost $1 billion. Not even one of those $1 billion to fix it. But they got 700 for more bombs that we don't need to go create more terrorists. Boom, we got it. So I've been saying in my stand-up act that when they say we're broke and we don't have money, they're using a Texas math book. Because we're the richest country the face of the earth has ever seen. We can afford stuff no matter what. When they say that you can't afford stuff, they don't mean we can't afford trillion-dollar bank bailouts, trillion-dollar wars, billion-dollar oil subsidies, and prison construction. That's not what they mean. They mean they can't afford anything that helps you.
And the crisis is multi-generational.
Just have a seat.
Serafina Galante is 76. This career social worker got her master's degree in her 50s. She graduated with about $35,000 in debt and owes more than that 19 years later, $38,000, partly because she can't even afford to pay the total interest every month.
I was one of the oldest students.
Senior borrowers like her are the fastest growing group of the student debt crisis.
It's not going to reduce ever. And the emotional part of it, that it's there, that it's always going to be there.
Serafina Galante told us she will die owing money to her college loan lenders, while Taylor Smith has put off getting married, starting a family, buying a home until she has these loans paid off. Frotman says policymakers at both the federal and state level need to address this crisis, and he says they have simply failed millions of Americans taking on a debt to pursue a better life.